Thank you for joining us. This is Brave New History. I'm here with Simeon Todoruk. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right.
Hmm, Pretty
Todoruk.
good.
All
Yeah, you got it good.
right, good deal. And yeah, we're talking about maybe you could describe it better. The Old Testament prophets, not historical characters, but they're more like what do you want to say? Literary.
Uh, exactly, literary compositions. Um, yeah, um, pretty much most of them are literary compositions. However, I will say that there are at least two prophets that are historical, and one is Balaam. We have his, but it's not what you find in the Bible. But we do have his, but we do
No.
have an archaeological evidence of Balaam along with one of his prophecies from the I think the 8th century BCE, so long after Moses, and we have Isaiah, the other one who is historical. In fact, in the Deuteronomist history, you actually come to Isaiah and you actually the word put in his mouth in the Deuteronomy history at the court seer of Hezekiah, and we found one of his inscriptions in the archaeological record. The only other one I could even throw a bone to, and I'm not even sure about, is a little gloss in Second Kings that says that there was a man named Jonah that prophesied, I think, to Jeroboam II. Named him. Now he might have been historical, he might have been a course here, but that's all it says. You don't get the Book of Jonah out of that. You know?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I've not heard that the idea of Balaam being historical. I mean, I'd imagine his talking donkey is also historical, but yeah,
Yeah, there's no talking donkey in the oracles
yeah.
of Balaam. What is interesting about that story is it's actually two stories in the Bible, and it looks like the earlier one had Balaam, not the talking donkey, but it's the one you get just after that, where in the book of Numbers, where Balaam basically gets the Midianites to go and cause the Israel to go commit fornication, and then he gets killed in the battle afterward. So that's, I think, the earliest one, and there's no reference to a talking donkey anywhere else in the Bible other than that one place.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. And so the non-historical prophets, what's going on with them? Like, I know, like Abraham literally means father of many, so it's a fitting name. It almost seems like he was named as his character, like what role he does.
uh,
Um, I'd
well,
imagine. Well, yeah. So what's going on with the other prophets that are
okay,
not
well,
historical?
there are basically three major prophets in the Hebrew Bible and 12 minor prophets. Um, I've already mentioned Isaiah. I don't, I don't think there's very much in the book of Isaiah you can put back to Isaiah with. I sort of alluded to in my video that maybe the one about the young woman being that everyone remembers, this one young woman conceiving and giving birth to a son whose name will be Emmanuel. Before the
Hmm.
child knows what to eat, this nation will depart. Um, that the part it's possible at the courts here someone would say something like that, but then you've got all this extra material layered on top of that, so it's very unlikely. Now, as for Jeremiah, which is the next major prophet, he is absolutely 100% a literary construct because he's not even mentioned in the Deuteronomic history, yet everything he says is right out of the book of Deuteronomy. He's constantly alluding to it, quoting it, using the same language. Um, and so Jeremiah seems to be more or less a literary construct. It's also, he placed at the end of the kingdom just before the exile, and Moses is at the beginning of the Deuteronomy history. He leads them out of Egypt. Jeremiah is going to take a bunch back into Egypt. And you've got the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Jeremiah prophesies on the opposite ends. So in Deuteronomy, you'll read that Yahweh will raise from among your brothers a prophet like me, Moses says. Well, you seem to have that on the opposite end with Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, I think, is a literary construct right after the Deuteronomist history was finished. Now, here's where we get into a complicated issue. Ezekiel. Ezekiel is definitely not a Deuteronomist prophet. It's from the opposite end, and I believe it coming from the Zadok communities, probably down in Qumran. And basically what they're doing is they say, "Oh, you're wiser than Daniel or Ezekiel. You did Noah, Daniel, and Job were here. I wouldn't save these people." And then it quotes Jeremiah, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are blunted. It uses quote from Jeremiah, uses obvious allusion to Daniel and the Deuteronomic history, but it completely reworks it, and you still have this saluted attack like you get in Daniel 11, where you get this apocalypse at the end. But in Ezekiel, it's the Gog of Magog. Daniel is told that you're going to be raised up at the end of days. In Ezekiel, it's basically a mockery of that, where you have the valley of dry bones. And in Ezekiel, the last 9 chapters are basically, well, we're going to restore this temple, and they're all going to be Zadok priests at the end of this restoration. So I believe Ezekiel, coming from the opposite end, is written against books like Daniel and Jeremiah. Now, for the minor prophets, Hosea is named very similar to one of the last the last king of the Northern Kingdom at the same time, almost the same time, Hoshea. And again, it's very, very Deuteronomist. Even the allegory that Hosea and Gomer go through permeates the entire rest of the book. Joel. Now, here's where I'm a bit confused. I haven't gotten into Joel very much yet, but I can tell you it's probably a little bit later than the others. It's very based on end times and apocalypse. Amos is probably one of my favorites, and it starts off with a poetic section and then runs into parable. But again, you get a typical calling of the prophet, a typical story of a Deuteronomist. The one thing about Amos, and I just did a video about this, is that whoever wrote Amos had historical documents on them, probably Syrian documents, that talked about an eclipse, that talked about an earthquake, and it probably dealt with the prosperity of the Northern Kingdom, because all those things in Amos seem to be somewhat historical. One other thing I will mention before I move on to the other prophet, you got an Amos, and then you have a Hosea. Actually, they're kind of out of chronological order. Well, that's kind of similar to Moses and Joshua, because actually Joshua's first name was Hosea in the text, or Hoshea or something like that in the text. So it kind of looks to be built up that way. So Obadiah is a small little book condemning the Edomites. I think you can, and uses parts of Jeremiah. I think you can place that a little bit further down into the 1st century BCE, when they're actually engaging with the Edomites, and eventually Herod's father will join into the dream of the Hasmoneans. Jonah, let's just not say anything historical about that book. I think we can skip over Jonah for now. Micah is, I think, Micah is a Deuteronomist prophet. The difference here is he's a little bit later in the dream of the Deuteronomist, because it's the latter half of Jeremiah actually quotes from Micah. Actually makes an allusion. It says there was the prophet Micah at one time, and he said all these things. So there's 2 layers to Jeremiah, and when I see that, I sort of separate the later layer a little bit later. So you're looking mid-2nd century, late 2nd century, basically, on some of these. So I don't see any of these guys really in history. Nahum makes rather odd predictions about Nineveh that I don't find very historical, although it did fall, but it just seems that it's they had to have somebody say something about Nineveh if they're going to put something in the time stream. Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk is a play, essentially. you got Habakkuk questioning how long will all these things happen, how long is all this going to happen, then Yahweh responds, and he responds back, and then it ends with a song. So it's essentially built in the form of a play. Habakkuk. So Zephaniah. Now Zephaniah is kind of early. It's I'm not sure if it's a historical Zephaniah or not. He seems to be placed in the royal line, descendant of Hezekiah. However, the words that Zephaniah is speaking is all fits into the typical pattern of the prophet. He called, he gives a judgment, a very harsh judgment in this case of Judah, right before they go into exile, and then a call for restoration at the end. Now, the last three prophets, which are placed in the Persian period, have a little bit of a discontinuity. Zechariah 1-8 and Haggai all start off with, it happened in this day of the month, and whenever I see that, it's identical to the opening of Ezekiel, it's identical to the way Noah appears in the P document. So I would tend to place Zechariah 1-8 and Haggai, which is all concerned with ritual purity, in the Qumran community, written against these things. Zechariah 9-14 and Malachi are actually probably originally one book. It's the burden of this, the burden of that, the burden on this, the burden on that, and it flows right into Malachi, which means messenger. So that was probably added on later, and then the books got separated when they wanted to make 12 books. So of all of those, some of them might have been some historical people. We know Isaiah was, and we can probably make some guesses about maybe Jonah or Zephaniah, but it's really difficult to place any of these people or any of the writings back in that time period when you see them basically arguing against each other half the time.
Yeah. So, what literary purpose do they serve?
Okay, so this goes back to the split in the priesthood, and I'm just going to explain, just give a background to this from somebody other than myself, and that's Margaret Barker. And she has what's called the two-temple theology, which she believes in a first temple theology and a second temple theology. Now, my problem is I don't believe there was a first temple, but the theology she's coming up with is what she calls first temple theology. Everything lines up with the Zadok priests, who were basically from at least the Persian period down into just before the Maccabean revolt, were basically in charge of the temple. After the Maccabean revolt, Jonathan Maccabee takes over, and for a time he was co-priest with the last Zadok priest. Then that Zadok priest got kicked out, and according to Qumran, he didn't start the community, but he started leading that community as the first teacher of righteousness. So we have a first and second temple theology, the Hasmoneans, the second temple theology. Both claim to be priests. Qumran basically says that temple is now totally corrupt. We got the old time religion. The Hasmoneans are saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to demythologize everything. Even the images on the coins disappeared during the time of John Hyrcanus, because they're not going to have any idols, just like Deuteronomy says. They're not going to do any of that. They're not going to have everything demythologized in the Deuteronomic history. So basically, the purpose it's serving is if you already have a Deuteronomic history where you got something placed back into the mouth of a figure named Moses, and you've got a history going up, and they have to grab onto Isaiah because he's historical. When you already have that, then the other side has to do something to respond to that. So, for instance, for Ezekiel, he's a Zadok priest, placed about the same time as Jeremiah, and they have to basically place them in that situation, and they're going to go back and forth in these different ways. So what happens is that when you get into the 1st century CE, basically you're getting into the time when they're starting to canonize these books. At least the Torah will be canonized at the very least, because the Samaritans will have their own version of that, And so what happens after the year 70 is the books are pretty much going to start being decided on, and they're going to use some very arbitrary ways to do this. But basically, they're going to try and get rid of anything that had come from Qumran, but at this point, they don't always know what comes from there. So they're going to use books like Ezekiel. They're going to use books like Zechariah and others that are from that community, but they're all toned down by this point, and they're put in a particular order where you'll notice that for Ezekiel it comes last in the major prophets. For all those other books like Zechariah 1:8 I mentioned, it's sandwiched between two Deuteronomy books. So basically it's the same way the New Testament will try and put Paul's material after Acts and have the general epistles on the other side, because they're trying to tone down Paul. That's about the same way you're looking at it in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've heard that the New Testament is laid out to be similar to the Old Testament.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. What was that?
Oh yeah, I've heard that the New Testament is laid out to mirror the Old Testament.
Yeah, actually, I would just depart into the New Testament because there's actually something similar going on in the New Testament, at least as far as I can see, and I'm sort of on the side of the Dutch radicals also. But I basically see if you want to be basic, a Pauline and a Petrine strand of the New Testament. There's a Jewish and a Gnostic side of the New Testament. And by the way, the Gnostic side might have even grown out of Qumran. So we have this two theologies of the New Testament, which I think at the end of the 2nd century and a little bit further down are going to start being brought together. And of course, like I said, they got to water down Paul in the book of Acts, and you got to squeeze him between all these other stuff, and then the pastorals for 2 Timothy and Titus will have Paul basically become a good proto-Catholic. And so you get sort of same thing happening in the New Testament that you get sort of in the Old Testament. I think the main difference is that in the case of the Old Testament, you have other books that made it into the Septuagint, at least, that Catholics and Orthodox still use today, that actually tell more of the story than a lot of Protestants realize and a lot of Jews realize, because some of those books that make it in there, like I'm working right now on Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, and if the dates of 132, which is subject for the grandson of Jesus ben Sirach, then it fits right into where I would expect it to, and it talks about Ezekiel, it talks about all these people, but it doesn't know about Ezra, and who I don't think was invented until much later, and it had a very Deuteronomic over sort of outlook to itself. So some of the books that are in the Septuagint, as you're going into the 1st century BCE and CE, some of these books made it especially into early Christian canons, which is why they're still in Catholic and Orthodox scripture today.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah. Okay, so one thing I will mention about the prophets being literary constructs is, if you read Russell Gmirkin's book on Plato and the creation of the Hebrew Bible, it sort of goes into this a little bit. And what he points out is that if you look around the ancient Near East and you look for prophets, like I mentioned Balaam, here's an example. If you read Balaam's prophecy, and you can go back on my channel and I have a video on the prophets, and if you read Balaam's prophecy, it doesn't read anything like what we have in the Bible. If these guys are really living in the 7th, 8th, 9th century BCE and all that, it just doesn't read anything like Near Eastern literature. Now, what it does kind of read like, at least in some cases, is the Sibylline oracles and other Greek oracles and such, and they read a lot like philosophical dialogues in certain cases. Now, the second half of Isaiah is a clear example of this. It builds up the idea of monotheism and the idea of the Persian, Cyrus having been the original Messiah and such. Now, I don't place this in the Persian period because I know that the Persians actually ruled Judah again in the 1st century BCE. But one thing that's important is that if you read the way that Isaiah is written, this last half, it's clearly very philosophical. And it's not something you would expect from the ancient Near East. It is something you would expect in the Hellenistic period, these long, huge dialogues. Also, I don't think that people from ancient times were looking around scrolls this large. The Isaiah scroll would fill basically this entire room if I rolled it out. So it's not something you would have seen in the ancient world that would have survived the Babylonian exile. So as far as this literature, I think you're basically looking from the Hellenistic period onward. And that's not to say that there's not ancient poetry that can be memorized or maybe a little bit written down that doesn't go back earlier. There is. The priestly blessing in Numbers is one of those situations, and maybe some of the Psalms. But for the most part, the prophets, the way they are literary constructs and basically arguing against each other. And you can actually see both sides of the argument, and you can see some cases like Detroit Isaiah, a completely new idea of we should actually be aligning ourselves with the Persians because Cyrus was anointed at one time, and we should be monotheists. We don't need to worship El Elyon and any of that anymore. So you see all these different ideas in the prophets, and they're all sort of arguing against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Yep. Right.
Well, I think the only thing I will add, and this is kind of something where I'm the only one that ever come up with this idea, and it could be completely wrong. But one of the things that I think, and this is probably extremely radical for most people about to hear what I'm going to say, is I think that the P and the D documents, that I mentioned, start coming out of the 2nd century, arguing against each other. But I think that the JE text is very, very late. And I think that it's a mined down version of Jubilees. And the reason so that may seem a bit radical, but if you look at the stories in Genesis that are associated with J, what is Cain and Abel, why are they fighting each other? I mean, just because there's some stupid sacrifice? I mean, what's going on? Well, in Jubilees, you know why they're fighting each other. They're jealous of each other, of their sisters and all that. You get, and the way it's constructed in Genesis, it's almost like it's based on Romulus and Remus, the idea of a sacrifice and all that. The story of Abraham and the 3 angels, one of which is Yahweh himself, he doesn't know that. He gives them food and everything, and then he reveals about Isaac. Well, where would a story like this come from? The only parallel we can find is in what's a story called Bacchus and Philemon by Ovid, and that's very early 1st century CE. So, and it's not in Jubilee, by the way, that story. So that's something that's interesting. One last one about Jubilees is that in Genesis, if you're reading Genesis, what happens is Jacob's daughter is raped, Dinah, she's raped, and then 2 brothers, Simeon and Levi, go and avenge her. And basically, they kill all the men of the city, take the woman captive, rescue Dinah and all that. But Jacob says, well, now the people are going to be mad at me and everything. They're going to come and try and attack me. Well, you don't see that happening in Genesis. It's just like it doesn't happen. There's no mention of it. You go into other stuff. But then you get a line that says, and all the people of the land were scared of Jacob and his family. Why? Because they kill a bunch of people in one city. There is a massive battle right after the rape of Dinah, but with the Canaanites, with different battles in Canaan, and they fight a whole bunch of people, and they kill a lot of people. There's a big battle, and that the people end up scared of them because they're winning all these battles by Yahweh's help. So what I see in what's called the JE text is I just think that that's much later, and it's mining out jubilees into a much shorter but simpler version that's more for building a constitution of a Torah, you could say.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't read Russell Gamaithan's book, so it's the whole idea of sorry, um, I haven't read Russell Gamaithan's book, so the whole idea of Cain and Abel being like Romulus and Remus, I've not considered that, or the whole super late dating to the
Okay,
Old
well,
Testament kind of. Yeah.
well, with Cain and Abel, there's a couple of parallels. Romulus and Remus I mentioned, and that can come from later Roman historians, but even that shows up in Greek literature at certain times also. But as far as Ross American, he points out in his Berosus and Genesis book that you can, from Berosus, for instance, you can make a case that Cain and Abel might be based on Enkidu and Gilgamesh to some degree, an early version of that in Berosus. So there's different parallels you can make. The reason I say Romulus and Remus is because if you're following if you follow the idea that I'm going with, that it's possible that the high priest, in the New Testament, you get Caiaphas as the high priest that Jesus is handed over to. Well, his father-in-law, high priest Ananias, and he based what happened is when he was high priest in the very early first century, he was appointed by the Romans, and they made Judea and Samaria into a Roman state. Now, when you have a Roman state, you have to have a constitution, even if it's not necessarily a Roman one. So the way I see things coming together, and as far as I know, I'm the only one that's ever done this, is I think that the JE text came together purposely to make those 5 books as the Constitution, a Judean and Samaritan Constitution at this point, and then the other 4 books, the Deuteronomic history, basically Joshua, Judges, Samuel, King, which the Samaritans didn't miss up. They would just filled in to make up the rest of it. And one little thing I'll throw out in the rather horrible chapters at the end of Judges, which are obvious interpolations, you get the story of the Levite concubine, but in the Civil War. Well, at the end of that, there's not enough wives left over because they killed all the Benjamite wives, and they have to basically gather wives. Well, how do you do it? Well, we have a festival year to year, and you can go and kidnap our daughters, and because we're not allowed to give daughters to you directly, so you can just kidnap them. Now, who ever wrote about anything like that? Livy, when he wrote about the Sabine woman. So this is another example of a possible pushing the date a little bit forward for the very finalization. And like I say, I think the source for a lot of it is Jubilee, but I think that you can make some cases that there are some small Roman stories mixed into the mix, sort of being Judaized to make a final constitution. And so the other thing is Philo is very, very quickly going to react to this and try and downplay a lot of it and allegorize a lot of it, because it is pretty nasty at the end when you get into things.
Yeah, gotcha. No, that's an interesting idea, and that's why it was taken as historical, right? Because it was essentially set up as historical. The the Torah as a as a state constitution.
Yeah, well,
Right?
I'm thinking of it as a constitution because the woman didn't necessarily come and say you have to absolutely follow Roman law. They actually let, contrary to what a lot of people believe, they just let people do most of their own thing. You know, most places had to pay taxes. Most places you had to give up certain people for soldier, like you talk and be put in the service. I think in the Gospels it says you got to go a mile, go 2 miles, and all that. Just sometimes you get put into service, but for the most part, Romans were pretty tolerant of Jewish beliefs until they started getting into heated disputes in the mid first century. So at the beginning, I just see a relatively peaceful relationship, as much as it can be, um, in the late first century BCE, early first century CE. It's relatively peaceful, and they did make it a state, that Judah and Samaria. So that makes sense why you would get JE material in there. You've also got the other side of the issue, the E material, the Samaritan material from the north. And if you ever use documentary hypothesis and actually pull apart J and E, when you get to the Joseph story, nothing makes any sense in either text. They absolutely have to be together. Same thing for the Balaam and the donkey. It's divided between JE. If you pull it apart, it doesn't make any sense. It has to be placed together. So JE must have been written maybe two people. I don't doubt that, but at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. All right, and then yeah, anything else we'd want to add before we head out or want
Yeah,
to?
yeah. When it comes to historicity of any person, you can't just say flat out just because something is a literary construct that that person absolutely didn't exist. Even with me, and I don't hold to a historical Jesus idea, but I mean, I'm not going to say there wasn't one. I just don't see the evidence for it. So when it comes to any of these figures, Abraham, Moses, and all that, I can see the way that they're created by literature, but I can't necessarily say flat out they didn't exist. It just doesn't look like it. Um, but I can say which people did exist, like I meant in Balaam. I can say Hezekiah existed. I can say that Cyrus existed and other people in history. But as far as some of these, sometimes you get people like Jonah that you just got to throw your hands up and say maybe, I don't know, because it sort of falls right in the middle and we can't really say anything. So when it comes to historicity of the prophets, I can't say that they didn't all live. It just doesn't look that way. It looks more like literary construction.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very interesting. And yeah, anything else you'd want to mention? That might be a good place to leave it.
Yeah, probably. I've got to get back to my job that I'm doing here. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
good deal.
thank you very much, and I'll keep you updated on anything. And thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and then thank everybody for watching. And yeah, have a great rest of the day.